at the world's most dangerous border. From the Korean border,
I noticed some parts of the river are very narrow.
It's very easy to cross this river.
to an open border, danger zones, and war zones. This week, we gather our team of correspondents for a look at some of our favorite stories from our third season of Full Measure.
One of the oldest cities in Europe, but in this current global war on terror, it has remained unscathed. So why so safe so far?
Just the way you describe it, it's troubling. Is Congress broken?
Congress doesn't stand up for itself.
Welcome to Full Measure. I'm Sharyl Attkisson. Today's something a little different. We're marking our third season of Full Measure by bringing together a group of intrepid correspondents for a look at some of the stories and topics we've covered this year. For most of you, they need no introduction. Scott Thuman, Lisa Fletcher, and Josie Sturman. One of the topics we want to talk about today we addressed several times, which is terrorism. I think it's of high concern to a lot of our viewers, and we have reported both domestically and on foreign ground about terrorism.
Yeah, one of the reasons we go overseas so often is because we want to show the angles that aren't getting enough attention, that aren't being reported on. And we also want to advance the story. And what I mean by that is our goal typically is to show people what may happen soon or what's going to happen, not what's already occurred.
And here's a clip of a story that we did down in the Philippines where ISIS, we found out, is having sort of a resurgence moving there, and also some of our work from our border coverage here in the United States.
We're invited aboard military fast boats accompanied by heavily armed commandos. It's the safest way to see the worst areas. Abu Sayyaf is now said to be lining up with ISIS, prompting some to make the argument that Islamic extremism in the Philippines deserves more of the world's attention.
Should we be worried about that?
There's no wall here, not even a fence. The only thing that separates two nations is the Rio Grande River. In 2016, the Border Patrol picked up more than 36,000 illegal immigrants in the two counties that make up the Laredo sector. To see for ourselves, we donned bulletproof vests and boarded an airboat escorted by armed Border Patrol agents.
I noticed some parts of the river are very narrow. It looks like it would
Yes.
not be hard to float or swim across.
It's very easy to cross this river.
So I went to the border at least 3 times, and part of the goal of that was to just go find out what's going on without a preconceived notion. When we were setting up interviews, people would say, are you pro-wall, against the wall? You know, what's your angle? And I said, we just want to find out what you think. And I think those were really fascinating pieces. You were in Europe several times.
Yeah, we were, and part of it that we're going to show you right here was really because we wanted to show how you have to go to these different places to see how they're managing terrorism, how they're trying to control the threat before the attacks happen. Here's a little clip. For the people of Britain, 2017 was a year of terror. A series of attacks using bombs, knives, and vehicles from Manchester to London. So now, a nation with already some of the strongest, most intrusive laws in the Western world when it comes to monitoring online activity is considering taking it a drastic step further.
We will change the law so that people who repeatedly view terrorist content online could face up to 15 years in prison.
Rome, one of the oldest cities in Europe, called the Eternal City, and has survived the rise and fall of empires. But in this current global war on terror, it has remained unscathed. So why so safe so far? After they find potential targets or threats, the Italians employ another fast tactic: deportation.
We kick off people from this country in a very early stage. We don't wait.
You know, one of the consistent threads we found was that people are always trying to figure out how do they contrast the threat by social media. and what's brewing out there on the internet.
Another threat to national security that doesn't really involve terrorism per se, you covered with what we called a story called Spying Eyes.
Right, and we were talking about China because China is a dominant maker and manufacturer of a lot of things, from cameras to cell phones. And a lot of times we end up looking at that as a trade issue, but it's not just a trade issue. It is a national security issue. So now I'm going to go back into the server room now that that surveillance camera has been hacked. And the surveillance camera that's been hacked has a frozen image of a clean room. You cannot see me. The only place I'm visible is on our cameras.
We spend billions of dollars on cyber security. It's like securing Jell-O.
Yeah, so, you know, the more we do these stories on cyber, the more I think all of us realize that this is the front line of new sorts of warfare.
Financial concerns and money concerns behind a lot of that too, I think.
And just ease. We'll just sign off on it and get those cameras.
All right, next, excerpts from more of our favorite stories. We look at some foreign threats that a lot of the media, we think, have ignored, and we'll hear from some key members of Congress as to why. We're back with our full measure look at some of our most interesting stories from our third season. And a recurring topic of high interest to our viewers is the swamp. We all work in Washington, D.C. We hear about that as much as any story, perhaps. One of the things that we found was there are Republican members of Congress criticizing their own leadership for what we call the swamp. And we interviewed several of them, including Darrell Issa, Ken Buck, and Jason Chaffetz. What were some of the investigations that this committee was stalled on that you hoped could be picked up now that's not been able to happen in terms of documents not provided by federal agencies?
Look, we have everything from the Hillary Clinton email investigation, which is really one of the critical things. There was the investigation into the IRS, and one that was more than 7 years old is Fast and Furious. I mean, we have been in court trying to pry those documents out of the Department of Justice, and still to this day, they will not give us those documents. And at the State Department, nothing. Stone cold silence.
To what do you attribute that?
They just seem to circle the wagons and think, oh, we can just wait you out. We can just wait you out.
Just the way you describe it, it's troubling. Is Congress broken?
Congress doesn't stand up for itself. I think it's really lost its way.
Do you think a lot of people come to Washington really hoping it will be different and planning to work for their constituents and just find out can't be done?
I absolutely think most members come here with the best intentions.
I've not heard another sitting member of Congress talk about these things. What happens to you now because of this?
You know, I didn't come here with any friends, Cheryl, and I'm not going to leave with any friends, and I'm okay with that. I did what I came here to do, and that's hopefully make Americans aware that this place is broken.
So the point is that these members of Congress were criticizing their leadership, saying that their own leadership won't let them conduct oversight into certain things, that there is so much conflict of interest at play that they can't get things done. So there is a recent average of polls conducted by Real Clear Politics that shows 3/4 of Americans give Congress a negative job approval rating. I thought it was lower than that.
Well, and that may be not a driving factor, but a factor in why you see so many resignations. It's easier to give up that job, and you see big names like Paul Ryan or Jason Chaffetz, who you interviewed. It is a tough town to deal with.
You know, if there is someone that's less popular in Congress, it may be the media, the news media, and that's another thing we reported frequently on, the media feeding frenzy, and basically how they've covered this president in particular, and the coverage that's different from what they perhaps have given other White Houses, and is it deserved or not? Have you ever seen anything like what's happened during Trump's first year?
There's more coverage of the president than we've ever seen before.
Frank Sesno used to cover the White House for CNN and the Associated Press. He now heads the School of Media and Public Affairs at the George Washington University.
The New York Times has 7 reporters assigned to the White House. When I covered the White House, I think the New York Times had 2. All right? So every word, every tweet, every movement, every inconsistency, every outrage, whatever, is tracked in real time and in multimedia fashion. And so, unfortunately, some of these things have led to mistakes.
Everyone here has covered Congress. You've also covered the president quite a bit. What's your takeaway as to this general mood that exists? You know, are the news media deaf to our own criticism of us, ourselves,
I think at times, because there's that thing called the Beltway bubble, right, where we kind of exist in our own world at times. But listen, there's always been a priority to cover politics with speed. The difference between this administration and previous ones is they're breaking news also sometimes on a minute-by-minute or hourly basis out of the White House, so then covering it becomes a challenge. The rule should be get it right, not necessarily get it first. And I think that's where there needs to be kind of a hip check.
Josie, when you go around the halls of Capitol Hill, what kinds of things do you hear about our coverage and what's going on there?
Well, they're definitely interested in the coverage more than they were before because it's coming out so fast and so furious, and that does impact the kind of comments you get. Sometimes there is a reluctance to say something. They're anticipating a tweet could come out on it later. They don't want to beat somebody to the chase. So there's a real difference in how members of Congress respond, and they're not as inclined to respond as much as they did before.
Now, because of the saturation of coverage with this White House in particular and politics in Washington, D.C., which I think is greater than I've seen. I used to work at CNN, and we had basically one show that covered politics throughout the day, and the rest was other news. So some of that has fallen off the radar, and we try to do a lot of that. One story we did, for example, was we went to the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea before anybody was talking about peace talks or negotiations with them, and here's an excerpt from one of those stories.
That is their northern boundary. This is our southern boundary.
We're at the world's most dangerous border.
Probably the most fortified position on planet Earth.
Lamb says today, nerves are on edge.
The Quezon Heights behind me, 10,000 pieces of artillery dug into granite that can range 50 million people in Korea when they're under this cannon fire. So so going to war here, nobody wants it.
Another piece that we tried to do, or more pieces that gave alternate coverage of topics you don't often hear, you did. You've actually traveled to quite a few places for us.
Yeah, there's actually a real war going on there. We're talking about the Ukraine and Russian border, and what many Americans don't know is that we, the United States, are upping our engagement. So we just heard a series of shots fired, not 100 yards away perhaps. We got down a little bit, but they say they're not terribly worried because they've become so used to it. It happens all the time. In some respects, you're outgunned or outmanned. Is that true?
Doesn't matter how many troops and we involved into offensive, Russia will involve even more troops than we do.
The U.S. 1st Infantry Division, deployed a century ago to fight in the First World War, is now back in Europe, here in Poland, standing alongside 28 other nations to defend against the biggest threat in decades, Russia.
I mean, that was dangerous stuff. It's really good insight that you brought us, though, from those front lines.
So, Scott, I'm curious, what's the U.S. role in the Ukraine war?
Well, for a long time, it's been to provide defensive weapons and some support, a lot of training. Now it's gone offensive. Now Congress has approved a lot of this. The president's behind it. And so they just received, for example, a bunch of Javelin anti-tank missiles. They're testing them out right now. They're excited about it. But the U.S. Selling $47 million of those to Ukraine.
And by the way, another piece we did touched on how much Russia and Ukraine are lobbying us, how much money they're spending to get us to spend money on their side one way or the other. That's another component of all this. Well, when we return, we'll touch upon our series of reports with tough guy Chuck Norris on a very real battle that he and his wife Gina have been fighting. We continue with our Full Measure Roundtable, looking at some of our most impactful stories of our third season. Some of our medical-related stories have been among the most important. Other media doesn't give as much coverage to them, partly because the medical industry has so much influence. Chuck Norris and his wife Gina have been waging to raise awareness about the use of a dye in MRI imaging.
Chuck Norris and his wife Gina are now suing McKesson Corporation and other companies related to gadolinium MRI dye. Dozens of gadolinium poisoning claims have been filed nationwide.
I want to try this case in the public because they would love for it to remain in the shadows and not be talked about.
The Norrises say the FDA hasn't done enough.
Well, they made some acknowledgement. They've moved the needle a little bit, but they haven't moved it enough.
Some people think because your name is on this cause that's what's helped it get attention, and maybe that's what even helped spur the FDA action after so many years.
I really don't think so. I think it's her, because she had a good way of explaining what is going on. I am just her companion. I am trying to keep her healthy. And that's what I've been doing, for several years now.
5 years.
After our first story at the Norrises talking about this poison that's in an MRI dye that can be dangerous for some people, Japan and Europe banned it. Dozens of countries, but not in the United States. So we talked about how the FDA has taken a different approach. They're issuing some patient warnings. They're doing other things, but they still say the benefit outweighs the risk. Very controversial. You covered medical stories, Josie, several of them, but one of them in particular about horrific human experimentation going on that hard to believe our government was part of.
Absolutely, our government part of it, and we actually traveled to Guatemala to report on these decade-old human experiments that were actually done by the U.S. military.
They were given sexually transmitted diseases in a project championed and funded by the U.S. Public Health Service and led by a physician named Dr. John Cutler.
When you start to look at Cutler's papers, do you realize right away, this is incredible? A little bit. But the other thing is, I'm a historian of medicine, so there are a lot of horror stories in the history of medicine. At what point did you find out what your dad had and what you have?
Vamos que ese mal tenía él, y ese mal pues creo que contaminó de primera, segunda y tercera clase, generación.
More than half the experiment victims went untreated, passing down the diseases like a tragic inheritance.
So the U.S. government did apologize after those experiments, but there was supposed to be this whole atonement effort, and it just completely fell through. Funding was there. The government just didn't carry it out.
Another place where medical crosses with privacy concerns. Lisa did one of those stories on DNA tests, which had information in there a lot of people never heard of before.
It was pretty shocking. We thought that we would take a look at those DNA tests. They sound so fun, but we found out that there is a significant risk to the science.
I traded in my lederhosen for a kilt.
Unlocking who you really are.
I'm everything. I'm from all nations.
Is the promise of at-home DNA testing.
I always knew, like, I'm Scottish, I'm English, I'm Polish, all these things, and so I was kind of expecting it to be reaffirmed. It's just kind of a fun thing.
So the objective here isn't just to sell DNA kits for fun?
That's only part of the business plan. The other part of the business plan is to sell that information to some other companies who are interested in your DNA.
So Lisa, the question then is, who's buying it and why?
Well, researchers are buying it, and there are two really interesting components of what's happening here. Researchers are buying it, and they're making big money. We're talking, there's the potential for billions of dollars to be made. And what most people don't know is, unless you opt out of your DNA being sold or opt in to these tests, they can take it and they can do research. And if you have some mutated DNA that might solve some, major sickness, they could make a drug out of it, they could sell it, you wouldn't know about it, and you would never make a cent.
And that's probably in the fine print, but nobody gets that out of the fine print.
Well, the fine print, we learned in the story, can change day to day or week to week, and they advise people to go back and keep checking.
Who here has had a home DNA test or done one?
I was scared out of it by Lisa's story.
Good job, Lisa.
All right.
All right, when we come back, we're going to take a look at a few scenes and moments you did not see in our reporting this year. This season, as we examine some of our most interesting and important stories, there have been some things on the road that you don't see in our reports, and we have to start with Scott on this.
Yeah, one of our favorite moments actually came off camera. We'd been overseas for almost a couple of weeks. At that point, we were at West Bank doing a lot of reporting in Israel, and the crew needed a little bit of a break. So photographer Brian Barr and producer Mark Orchard and I hopped in the car. We carved out a few hours in the morning, and we drove to the Dead Sea. And here we are,
oh, yeah.
GoPro on my foot, as we just lay back and floated, enjoying the salinity of the Dead Sea at 1,400 feet below sea level. Really an experience, just to be a tourist for a moment. We loved it.
That's awesome. We do get to do some very cool things. Josie?
Well, we were on the road in Guatemala, and you have to understand, on these trips, you're trying to do as much as possible, so you were driving constantly. We probably racked up 500, 600 miles in 5 days, but everywhere we went, we saw the same chicken truck, this tiny, tiny chicken truck. That doesn't even do it justice. The thing is maybe 4 feet long. Same lady drives it. No matter where we went, in the middle of nowhere, she was there. In the
Maybe
city,
she was
there.
following you.
Maybe. Well, I said I was going to drive it home, but I don't think it would have made the trip.
Did you eat chicken from the chicken truck?
I did eat chicken from the chicken truck.
Okay, that's enough said.
Yeah.
Lisa?
Well, we've been to a lot of cool places, but one of my favorite moments from this year was actually a moment with a member of Congress. I mean, generally we're talking about pretty heavy issues. The members of Congress are fairly serious-minded, but sometimes they will surprise you. Like when I was trying to get to the bottom of why Congress hasn't plugged this hole where hundreds of millions of dollars are incorrectly paid, often to those who are dead.
Is it possible that one of the reasons this isn't getting fixed is because dead people don't vote?
Well, in Delaware, they do. And that's how I've won 13 straight elections.
That's Senator Tom Carper from Delaware, and he was a fantastic interview, but he broke up our entire crew a couple of times with laughter.
Awesome. Well, I have so many favorite moments. One reminds me of your chicken truck. There are Jolly Bees in the Philippines. This is like their McDonald's, and we had to eat there, and it does have actually very good fried chicken, but it's very popular. But a lot of people ask me, was I scared? Because we went to this region of Mindanao where ISIS is coming back and where they've had a lot of Islamic extremist terrorism attacks and hostages taken. And no, I wasn't scared. And here's why. Take a look at this picture. This is pretty much how we often rolled when we were in the Philippines. And
that's a security detail.
In fact, I've never felt safer. So anyway, good times, great travel, good stories. Thank you all. I mean, you've really done some fantastic original reporting that I know our viewers so much appreciate. And so that is it for Full Measure Season 3. We're very happy to say that we will be back for Season 4 this fall. We want to thank all the people who help bring Full Measure to you week after week, behind the scenes. Sometimes you see them on social media. We put clips on there of these people for you to check out, and so engage with us on social media. We leave you now with a look at some of the incredible places and scenes that we've been able to experience and bring to you this season.